Hello and welcome. My name is Amelia Larson. I serve as the Executive Vice President of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. Thank you all for joining and for everything you're doing for children. If you are on social media, remember to use the hashtag ArcLearns as you share your learning and contribute to the learning of others. Now, it is my honor to introduce you to our outstanding guest. Nell Duke is a professor in literacy, language, and culture, and also in the combined program in education and psychology at the University of Michigan. Nell Duke's work focuses on early literacy development, particularly among children living in poverty. Her specific areas of expertise include development of informational reading and writing in young children, comprehension development and instruction in early schooling, and issues of equity in literacy education. She is author and co-author of numerous journal articles and book chapters. Nell has been named one of the most influential scholars in the United States, and you will see why. She also has a strong interest in improving the quality of educational research training in the United States. And I think we can all agree that that is an imperative. We are living in turbulent times where we can expect an avalanche of misinformation, confusion, and division that follows. As educators, we have our work cut out, staying informed and achieving urgently needed improvements in literacy outcomes. I cannot imagine a better time to have this conversation. Today's webinar is brought to you by American Reading Company. We are committed to making a difference in the lives of children, educators, and communities. Our complete literacy operating system delivers the literacy victory we have been waiting for in this nation. Every child, an expert reader for their own reasons. Every classroom, a vibrant intellectual community of engaged researchers and citizens. Every school, a system of excellence for all. Now join me in welcoming Nell Duke.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks to people all over who have come today to be with us and hear this presentation. I really appreciate it. We'll try to make it interactive and have some conversation as well. I want to start out by saying that do's and don'ts sounds a little bossy, and I don't want to seem bossy. I just thought the device worked well, and I Googled do's and don'ts of to see what popped up, and you can see that this is a widely used imperative, and I want you to know that I'm not involved in weight training, so I don't know why that came up so high. But anyway, I don't want to seem bossy, but I will talk today about some things that we should be doing and things we should not be doing in our classrooms. Amelia had asked me today to focus on 3 publications. One is a blog post from 2016 that Heidi Ann Mesmer and I did. Heidi Ann Mesmer is a professor at Virginia Tech, called Teach Sight Words as You Would Other Words. The second is a piece from 2020, When Young Readers Get Stuck, which appeared in the journal Educational Leadership. And the third is a piece that came out in the winter of 2018-2019 called Phonics Faux Pas, Avoiding Instructional Missteps in Teaching Letter-Sound Relationships. So those 3 pieces will be the focus of my remarks today. The first one is available free online, and the third one is available free online. The middle one, you do need to be an ASCD member to access that for free. Otherwise, there is a charge. All right, so I'm going to start with this blog post from 2016, Teach Sight Words as You Would Other Words. And I want to start by just clarifying some terminology. So the term high frequency words, which is the term you're going to hear me using a lot, means a word that appears commonly in the language. So said and was and the and they, those are high frequency words in English. They come up a lot. A sight word is not that. A sight word is actually any word that can be read automatically or at sight. So yes, for any of you on this session and for me, and we hope for many kids, you know, said and was and the and they are sight words, but so for me is orthography. So a sight word is any word that you can read automatically or at sight. Now, it's important to understand that high frequency words can be of at least 3 types. Some high frequency words are regular, meaning that they're pronounced just as you would expect. So the word can is spelled and pronounced just as you would think it would be. Some are entirely irregular. This is very rare, about 4% of words in English. So OF for of is an entirely irregular word. You just would not predict that pronunciation from those letters. Many high frequency words are of a mixed type, meaning that some of the letter sound relationships are just what you would expect and others are not. And so said is an example of that, right? The S is what you would expect and the D is what you would expect, but you wouldn't expect AI to make the sound in said. So the key point here around don't is don't have children memorize high frequency words as wholes. For a long time and in lots of classrooms, you see this idea that, oh, these words are difficult or these words are irregular. And so I just have to have kids kind of memorize them as a whole function. Sometimes you see teachers drawing shapes around a high frequency words in an effort to try to help children learn them. That's actually not how we best teach high frequency words. So, you know, giving kids stacks of flashcards and just hoping that they'll, you know, read the word as a whole without ever really fully analyzing the letter sound relationships within the word is problematic. Instead, what you want to do is teach high frequency words through full analysis of the graphophonemic structure of the words. That is, you want to work with children to actually understand the letter sound relationships in the word. And this is even of words that may not be spelled as expected. So for example, this comes from Linnea Aries' research, and you see that we actually map the word sign, S-I-G-N, which is arguably a fairly high frequency word. We map that into the phonemes that the graphemes represent. And we do that with children because research suggests that that's what really helps to cement those high frequency words and any word into memory to the point where it can eventually become part of the sight vocabulary. So let's practice this a little bit together. Let's take the word was and just think to yourself, how would you map that out? What sound does each grapheme in the word stand for? So hopefully you're thinking the W stands for, the A stands for and the S stands for Z. It's not really, right, what would be expected, but going through that mapping process with children is an important piece of instruction. Here's another one, through. So map that on in your mind, how that maps out. And you hopefully mapped those letters into a total of 3 sounds, right? Ooh, that's it. So that's how you would work that through with kids initially. And I put get here. Think about how you would map that. And I can tell you that there are probably within this call a couple different ways you might have mapped that, because some people pronounce that word with what sounds like a short E sound and some pronounce it with what sounds like a short I sound. And so that's a really important point as well, is that you want to make sure that children are mapping to their pronunciation of the word in their oral language. That's one of the ways that we make sure that we're being dialect sensitive when we are engaged in phonics instruction. All right, so here's another don't with high frequency words. Don't think of high frequency words as one thing like over here and your phonics scope and sequence as this other thing over here, entirely separate. Rather, think about ways in which these are entirely or partially at least related. Oh, sorry. So for example, if you are teaching at a given point, well, actually, let me go on and then I'll come back to that in a second. So instead, what you should do is to try to connect your high frequency words to the graphophonemic patterns that you're already teaching when possible. And I want to emphasize the when possible. If we take a word like the, I want to teach the to children before in the scope and sequence, I'm going to have gotten to the TH digraph. But when you can, it is good to try to connect graphophonemic patterns you've taught to the high frequency words that you're focusing on. So here's another don't teach all of your high frequency words as one-offs. It's so common that I'm in classrooms and the teacher is maybe teaching or sending home a list of high frequency words for children to study, and they're unrelated to each other. And you know that really works against our sort of pattern seeking brains. So that's not what I would recommend. Instead, I recommend that when you can, you cluster high frequency words. Not just I recommend that. Heidi Ann Mesmer, my co-author of the blog post, and many others recommend that. So let's practice that. Think about if you were teaching kids the high frequency word no, are there any other high frequency words that you could teach at the same time?
Like go, so.
Exactly, go so. So I would teach no, go so as a cluster. Then I'm reinforcing that pattern with kids and sort of take advantage of the learning from one word, helping the learning from another word. And I'm keeping their focus then on the letter sound relationships in the word, which is where we want them to be, rather than the idea that they would memorize it by a shape or as some kind of gestalt. Now let's think about should. What words would we teach with should? So probably a lot of you are thinking could and would. Yeah. I would teach those as a chunk, right? Because they're unusual, but they're a cluster together. And so teaching should, would, and could together makes a lot of sense. And by the time you're teaching those words, you've already worked on like the SH digraph. So, you know, you're not worried about that. So another don't teach too many high frequency words too early. And probably by now you can figure out why that is. We know that high frequency word instruction is more efficient when we engage children in analyzing the graphophonemic patterns in words. And to do that, they have to know a lot of the letter sound relationships, at least the consonants, and hopefully working on the vowels. And so if you're teaching high frequency words in pre-kindergarten, and I do see this, unfortunately, in districts, I've even worked with districts where they have benchmarks for the number of high frequency words that they want kids to know at different points of time in pre-kindergarten. What you're doing is you're putting that high frequency word instruction out ahead of where your phonics instruction is. And so that pushes kids into this memorization and focus on shape and order of letters, and pushes them away from that more graphophonemic analysis that we want to see. So we want to make sure that we wait to teach a lot of high frequency words until we've got these kind of precursors in place, because high frequency word will be more efficient when kids have that basic letter sound knowledge, when they have some basic phonemic awareness, right? They need to be able to blend some sounds together to really be able to take full advantage of the instruction. And also kids really need concept of word. Research suggests before their high frequency word instruction is likely to be very efficient. So this is, oh, sorry.
No, I think that this piece related to having the concept of a word is something that is so often ignored in the field and so critical. So I was just, yes, agree.
I totally agree, Amelia. There's quite a lot of good research on the relationship between acquisition of concept of word and other aspects of children's literacy development. But I think you're right that it doesn't get really understood or discussed very much. And just to make sure everybody knows what I'm talking about here. So concept of word, you can have a concept of word orally, like when kids start to understand that I love you is 3 words and LMNO is not 1 word in the alphabet. But then when we go to concept of word in print or concept of word in text, that's understanding that we represent those words with a series of letters and that there's a space on either side, that a space with no letters in it is what tells us that we've moved on to the next word. This is my best guess. There hasn't been research that has, tested specific patterns across K1, 2 in, how many high frequency words to teach when, but based on my read of the research, this is my best guess. Okay. So now I'm going to stop sharing so we can talk a little bit, Amelia, before I move on to the next piece of writing.
Michelle, let's start with a couple of questions that Nell needs to take, and then I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we have made to call attention to how we learn sight words. So,
sure. I think one thing that came up was around the dialect sensitive comment that you used when you talked about mapping, and maybe if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure, good. So, so probably, many of or all of you listening to the webinar know today that everyone speaks in a dialect. So I made reference to something about my dialect. I was born and raised in the Midwest, and I have, features of dialect. For example, I tend to nasalize my vowels. So that's where I was doing the kind of exaggerated, I'm happy about the nap. So everybody speaks in a dialect, and our dialect influences the ways in which we read aloud, right? And the ways in which we process words. And it's very important that when we're teaching reading with young children, that we're aware of every child's dialect and the ways in which that is reflected in their reading. So if I have a child who reads the word get, G-E-T, get, and I know that in their dialect they say get, then that's fine. They're mapping that word onto the meaning that we want them to map that word onto. And right, that's the key, is you want that mapping between the letters that they're seeing, the sounds they're associating with them, and then the meaning that they associate with that. And so just asking all teachers, really be very aware of, educate yourself about the different dialects that may be represented in your classroom. And then when you're teaching reading, make sure that you're not correcting a child's pronunciation of a word during reading instruction that really is actually how that child pronounces that word in their oral dialect.
I can see us having a whole session just about that. So I keep telling you, you're going to come back. What else, Michelle?
For sure, because when you talked about the short A words, I was thinking here in Philadelphia, we pronounce G-A-S very differently than other places across the country. We have gas here in Philadelphia. All right, so follow-up question is, do we worry that that might then impact students' spelling, like that they might spell the word get G-I-T? Is that a concern?
Well, yeah, I think worry is not quite the right, not quite how I would frame it, but yeah, so everybody's dialect affects their spelling. And we know that English is not a very phonologically transparent orthographic system. It's more morphologically transparent. What does that mean? It just means that in English, we tend to privilege morphological relationships, or the smallest unit of meaning in words. We tend to privilege those relationships in how we spell things. So an example I often give is the word magic and magician. If you spelled magician the way it sounds, it would look really different than how we spell magician in English. But the way that it's spelled helps signal to us, oh, that's related to magic. So that's where English has a strength in that regard. English is good at showing meaning relationships among words, but English has a weakness in the sense that it's not a very orthographically transparent, it's not a very clean language in terms of the closeness of the spelling to the pronunciation. So everybody has to sort of be braced for the fact that words are not going to be spelled the way that they sound to them all the time, right? Right. So, everyone's dealing with that, but it's true that, any given student is dealing with that through the lens of their dialect. So yeah, they might well write get, G-I-T, and then you just say, oh, when we write that word, we spell it G-E-T. you know, just like a child might write through, you know, Throo, and then you say, yep, well, that does sound like that, but in English we spell through Through, right? So it's just that same sort of set for, you know, helping kids move toward conventional spelling over time.
Oh, I think our founder must be so happy right now if she's listening to you, because that's what she says to us all the time. But Michelle, can you talk? I know I saw a couple of questions related to ARC materials. Can you just quickly take that on before we move on to the next part?
Yeah, sure. And I think I can give two answers to that. The first answer is to say that ARC's materials, in terms of the foundational skills toolkits, were updated last year to more fully integrate the work of orthographic mapping across the color levels, right? So we're drawing kids' attention, even with these high frequency words that we are teaching, you know, earlier in kindergarten, that we are drawing attention to the letter sound correspondences. It's not the visual memorization kind of piece. So that update happened last year. And then this year, what we have coming is there's a reorganization of some of the power words where we've sort of grouped them in the 2 green level in particular, because we're moving students from that partial orthographic to more fully orthographically mapping the words. So in 2 green, we're doing the work of separating out those power words into the irregular, the words that contain irregular correspondences, and the words that have regular correspondences that can be taught in the way that that Nell described in terms of the no, go, so, that we're grouping some of those words together so that they can be instructed upon in that way.
So the next article I'm going to be talking about at Amelia's request is an article called When Young Readers Get Stuck. This is a more recent piece. This was just this fall, and it was published in Educational Leadership from ASCD. And again, unfortunately, it's not available free anymore. It was about the first month that it was published. Now it is behind a paywall. You have to pay a little bit.
But let me say something, because Nell is an incredible researcher, but also very humble. So let me say this. This article is probably the most important article I have read in the last 2 years. And I think it is an article that requires close reading, conversations around, because if we don't understand the processes behind what we do, we may not be doing right by kids. So this is a must-have. It's not a nice to have. So maybe like really spending a little bit of money on this one is critical. Say this now, you know, this is why I first contacted you. I think this article is just, it changes the conversation. So please.
Well, thank you so much. That's very kind. And I do want to make it clear to the audience that I don't get any of the money. So I have no financial interest in this whatsoever. But I do agree that this is a hard article to just present about. I think it's really an article meant to be read. So I'm going to hit some high points, but I feel like you really need the larger context. So I also want to say that this is actually an area where there is a need for more research. There's some very, in my opinion, obvious studies that need to be done that haven't been done. And so this is just my best guess based on the research we have to date, which is actually true of anything I ever say. But anyway, I'm going to say the don't provide prompt soup. And what I mean by that is don't have a bunch of prompts floating in your mind and then just whichever one shows up on the spoon, that's the one you use. We really want to be very, very intentional about our prompting. And as Amelia has implied, that means that you really need to understand processes that underlie the process of reading. So you want to align your prompts to your purpose. And to get into that, I want to first back up and just talk about this table from the article. So when a child is reading, there are many things that are going on in their brain at the same time, or one, right after the other, and it's very complex. So one of the questions that a young reader needs to have in mind is, what is that word? So that's decoding and word identification. It's really about the pronunciation of words. But another question they need to be thinking about is, did I read that word right? Or did I read those words right? So that's over in the comprehension dimension, and particularly comprehension monitoring and fix-up. Another thing that kids need to be thinking about is, well, what does that word mean? So that's really where vocabulary knowledge and strategies come in. So notice the distinction here, the pronunciation of words, the meaning of words. These are two things that both need to be in children's minds. And then the broader question of what does this text mean is important. It's what enables good comprehension monitoring, and is also the point of reading. And then the motivation question as well, why am I reading this in the first place? Why does this matter? And so there's just a lot that kids are thinking about. And we want to really align our prompts to what thing we are trying to get kids to think about at any given moment in reading. So let's take word identification. So I suggest that when we're prompting kids and our purpose is we want to help that child learn to identify words, then our prompts really need to be focused on word identification. So a great one is look at that word, because we so often have kids who will, look at our faces instead of look at a word when they're stuck. And we really want to make sure they're looking at those letters both to help them get the word, but also because once they get it, then they'll associate what they just read with those graphemes, and that contributes then to the orthographic mapping. But slide through each sound is another good prompt once they are looking at the word. And I know many of you probably are familiar with sound it out. You might use that phrasing. My collaborator, Christine Schutz, and I don't use that phrasing because we feel that it often results in a choppy kind of pronunciation and an overabundance of us. And so we like the slide through because we think it implies a connected phonation, and there's increasing evidence that connected phonation is really helpful to kids in their word identification. Two other prompts that work well for word ID: try a different sound. There's a lot of research in which that's one of the prompts that kids are taught. It has different names. Vowel flexing is another name you hear for it. But it's basically, if you tried a long O and it didn't work, try a short O, and so forth, and then break the word into parts. So that's when we get to our longer multisyllabic words, or at least words that have a larger number of letters in the onset and the rhyme. And that's a way of getting kids to really break that apart so that they're going piece by piece. So in contrast, if what we're trying to do, if our purpose is to try to get a child comprehension monitoring more, then that's where we would use different kinds of prompts like check it, does it make sense? Or did that make sense? Did that sound right? So let me sort of talk about the timing of this. So the prompts I just showed you for word ID are prompts you would use when the kid is stuck on the word, like before they've read the word. And then after they've read the word, whether correctly or incorrectly, that's where we kick in with check it, did it make sense? So the monitoring is the way that we know, or at least have a good idea of whether what we just read makes sense or not. So this before and after piece is really critical to understanding this. We're not prompting kids to think about sense before they've decoded the word. We're prompting them to think about sense after they've decoded the word as a way of checking on the accuracy of the reading. You'll see a second thing that I put here as a prompt is actually no prompt because, we really need children to get to the point where they notice on their own that they've misread a word, that it doesn't make sense. And to get them to that point, we need to give them a little space. So we don't jump right in and say, you read that wrong. We wait and we see if they can correct it themselves, if they can notice themselves that they've misread a word. And if they do, a good prompt is, you noticed something didn't make sense and went back to correct it. Good readers do that. I know some people don't like that good readers language, and I understand. You could just say that it's good to do that. And then try reading that again. Rereading is, you know, a powerful strategy that you can use for several purposes, but certainly it's a great strategy when the kid has not noticed that they've misread something, that it doesn't make sense. You're going to send them back, try that again. So those are some comprehension monitoring prompts. And I should point out, you know, sometimes people ask me, well, you know, why do they have to figure out on their own that they misread the word? Why shouldn't I jump in right away all the time? And it's because I'm operating in the assumption that the way that classrooms are set up in the US, the number of kids in a classroom and the amount of volume reading that we need young children to do in order to really become effective and proficient readers, they're not always going to have an adult by their side. Yeah. So I want them to get to the point where they notice on their own, I just must have misread that word because that didn't make sense. Or, you know, there are lots of other reasons it might not make sense, like, you know, they just didn't understand or they don't know the meaning of the word or whatever. So it's because of the reality of kids, not every kid having an adult next to them all the time. That's why I want children to learn to notice when they've misread a word. Yeah. So a third chunk of prompts that I share in the article are prompts for vocabulary. So, you know, this is, again, a sort of separate piece, which is there's the decoding of the word, and then there's figuring out what that word actually means. And so sometimes that's our purpose. That's what we need to help kids with. And so you can use various prompts, and you see some here on the screen that are really directed toward helping kids figure out or ascertain the meaning of words. And I think part of the confusion in the field over prompting, and I think there are a bunch of reasons for the confusion in the field over prompting, but I think part of it is people being not sufficiently clear about these different purposes that, you know, you use context to help you figure out the meaning of a word, but we don't want to be using context to identify the word in the first place, or at least we don't want it to be our primary goal at all. We really want kids to identify words by looking at the letter-sound relationships or considering the letter-sound relationships. We want them to use context and other strategies when they're trying to figure out what that word means. So I'm hoping that distinction makes sense. I probably explain it better in the article, I hope. Anyway, I thought we'd practice together. So on the screen, let's say that the text said, this is a slug, and the child said, this is a, and then they look up at your face for help. So just think to yourself, what of these prompts on the right-hand side of the screen might I use? And I'm just going to give you a few seconds to kind of think that through. So I would use look at the word first off, because they've looked up at my face and my face does not have any letters on it. And so that is not going to help move them forward. And then I would go to slide through each sound. Slide through each sound is a great choice for the word slug, because indeed, you know, slug is going to get you to that word. Let's practice another one. The text said, Jade couldn't believe his selfishness. The reader said, Jade couldn't believe his, and then they just stop, and there's a long pause. So think about what prompt you would use in that situation. So for me, in this situation, I would use break the word into parts. This is not one where I would say slide through each sound, because that would be a very long process for the word selfishness, right? And that's not, you know, when a reader is at the point where they're grappling with texts that have a word like selfishness in it, they're not at a stage of reading where they need to be going individually sound by sound. And so I would do break the word into parts for that one. So this kind of implies a do that I want to share with you, which is just the idea that we need to remember to keep development in mind when we're selecting word identification prompts. In those earlier stages of reading development, it makes sense to cue kids to slide through each sound. That fits the kinds of words that they're able to read at that point, and that fits the phase of reading development in linear Aries terms that they would be at that point. Whereas later in development, when the words are much longer, they probably have multiple morphemes in them, and the child is really at more of a consolidated alphabetic phase of word reading development, then at that point, we're going to look for something more like break the word into parts. So just keep development in mind. Let's practice another one. The text said, They can even turn their heads upside down. And the reader said they can even turn their heeds upside down. So ask yourself what you would do in this case. So hopefully you're in the middle part of the prompting guide to the right here, because you're thinking about, now we see some evidence that we might not be comprehension monitoring, right? So I would first of all wait, at least to the end of the sentence. Sometimes I see a teacher jump in as soon as the child says heeds. We don't want to do that, right? We want to see if that child is picking up on their own that they misread the word. But then if they didn't, this would be one where I'd say, check it. Does that make sense? Or if they read it pretty choppily, I might even say back what they said. You read, they can even turn their heeds upside down. Did that make sense? So we're really, pushing on the comprehension monitoring there. So my don't is, don't jump in too soon. Give children some time to really hopefully start to be catching some of those reading errors on their own. Here's another one. The text said their ears are hidden behind their facial disc feathers, and the reader read their ears are hidden behind the facial disc feathers. So you might not have even caught the difference, right? The word was there and the kid said the. So think for a minute what you do. And I'll say that I think the field is all over the map on this right now. There are definitely people in the field who are saying that you must correct every reading error. My point of view, my best guess at this point, based on the research we have, is that you just let this go. And it's not so much, the main reason is because we only have so much instructional time with kids in a day. And if I'm going to spend some time instructionally with this kid, it's not going to be going back working on they and there. There are other things that are going to be a higher priority. So in an ideal world, if I had a one-on-one tutor for a kid 24 hours a day, then maybe, but not under current instructional circumstances. I just wouldn't bother with, that non-meaning changing, very minor, similar kind of thing. And, in fact, adults make those kinds of very minor reading errors all the time. So my don't is don't sweat the really small stuff if it's going to take time away from more pressing instruction and prompting, other things that are a higher priority for working on with that child. Okay, so here's another one. Most owls rely on their keen hearing for hunting rather than their excellent vision. And let's say that the reader read it kind of like, in a very choppy way. And when they got to vision, they said vision, and that's it. So look at the prompt guide, and I'll first say that, well, go ahead and take a look and see what you would do. So here, what I see in practice a lot of times is that educators will start working on the decoding of vision. And I think that that's probably not the best place to put your energy here, because with as rich as the context is leading up to the word vision, it's something that owls have and do well, that's not hearing, that's a sense for hunting, my guess is that the issue here is bigger than just decoding the word, that the word is probably not in their oral vocabulary. So in this case, I would probably say, that's word is vision. Do you know that word? No, I don't. Are there clues to what that word might mean? And there are lovely clues here. So, well, I'll move on to the next example and then make a broader point. So the text said they grab their prey with claws called talons that are very sharp. And the reader says they grab their prey with claws called talons that are very sharp. So think again here what you would do. So for me here, talons, first of all, is a very plausible pronunciation for talons. It happens to be talons, but when we have that consonant, vowel, consonant word pattern, as probably many of you know, there are often, you'll get either a long or a short vowel variant in that initial syllable. So, it's a very plausible pronunciation of that word. My guess is they don't know the meaning of the word. The word's not in their oral vocabulary. So I would probably say, oh, that word is talons. What do you think that word means? Or think about what that word means. And again, the sentence context here is very rich. So hopefully they would be able to answer that question. So this leads me to another do, and I think this is actually a very weak area in the field in general, which is to understand the relatedness of decoding and vocabulary knowledge. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people have the idea, oh, well, decoding is over here in word reading, and vocabulary is over here in language comprehension. And so they think of them as very separate. But in fact, what research shows is that decoding and vocabulary knowledge are quite strongly related. Your vocabulary knowledge absolutely affects your decoding, and actually over time your decoding affects your vocabulary knowledge. And so these things are intertwined, and that's why, as we're prompting kids as they're reading, we want to think about what I just saw. Is that a decoding issue, or is it that they don't have that word in their old vocabulary anyway? And that helps me think about, where and how I'm going to intervene and prioritize. So to sum up, there are many different things that are going on in the mind of a young reader when they read. And my hypothesis is that the field would move forward in our prompting work if we would be able to become more organized in our thinking about the different questions a reader is grappling with, and what our purposes then are for prompting, and then the implications that has for which prompts we use. And I totally acknowledge that this is a pretty complex, endeavor that I'm asking for, but I think one that is well worth our time and effort. The final point I want to make on this before I turn for a little bit of conversation is just that everything I've shared in the broader article really has implications for the choices that we're making for texts for young readers. We want to make sure that we're choosing texts for children that reward attention to the letters and words. So we want to have texts that are written with decodability in mind and matching the challenge of the text from a letter sound perspective to roughly where that child is in their decoding development. But we also need the texts to be meaningful, to make sense, so that the kids can be comprehension monitoring. So we need that consideration of decodability, but we also need that consideration of sensibility of the text. And finally, we want text to be sufficiently engaging for children that they actually want to monitor their comprehension, figure out unfamiliar words, and persevere through the text. And so these are what we call multiple criterion texts.
One of the things that we talked about when I just raved about your article is the fact that like when we look into Aries phases early on in pre-alphabetic, when kids come in, they may not know letters, they may lack phoneme awareness, but they do bring assets with them. And I told you that I believe that kids are naturally picture readers. They do that. They read the world. That's the asset that they bring with them. And it is our job to not to stop them from using what an asset is, but to take them to the next level of what they are not doing yet. It is through our instruction that we help kids move from solely picture readers to being word readers, but they are still gonna read the world. And I think for me, just talking to you about this and you helping me understand that the question, because I see myself when I first came to the country and I did not understand English at all, and sometimes I read the world through pictures and it helped me, and I see little ones. But I think the point is not that. The point is, how does our instruction move kids from what they do naturally to what they are not doing yet? How do we move them to prompt and pay attention to the next thing that they need? And it doesn't stop. And now I have to say, if there was a Nobel Literacy Prize, I don't know if there is or not, I really think you should get it, a Nobel Literacy Peace Prize. I'll create one and I'll give it to you. But I think this is so deep, and even like how you took us through the prompts, it is rocket science. It's not simply don't do this or do this. It's when you do it based on what they need. And if we are really interested in getting kids, all kids, ready to fly and not slow walk kids through school, I think that paying attention to what they already do and help them do what they need to do next with the right prompting is really the way to go. So I want to thank you again, and I want to pass it on to Michelle. Michelle, are there questions? I'm sure there are, but we only have 8 more minutes, and I do want, because Nell has a very important point that I want her to make before she leaves, but are there things that you are seeing in the chat box that would help lift the group's understanding overall?
Yeah, I think there was one question that I saw that sort of connects the couple pieces that you've gone through. And it was, I'm concerned about a growing body of legislation in many states that seems to prohibit anything other than phonic decoding. What are we to do about this, and how can educators advocate for prompts like the ones that you've shared when they're used at an appropriate time?
Aha. Okay. Well, I mean, to be clear, phonic decoding is exactly how we should be identifying words. So I think the question is really, how do we make sure that we're not just spending the whole day on identifying words, we're also making sure that we have some time to work on comprehension monitoring, to work on vocabulary, and so on. And I mean, a careful read of the legislation, I think the legislations that I've seen nationally, they're not, I think, at least the ones I've seen, they're not really saying don't pay attention to comprehension or don't pay attention to vocabulary. I think what they're saying is that, you know, do make sure that you're paying attention to word reading, and do make sure, you know, that you're taking a phonics oriented approach to word reading instruction. And so I don't think that we're legislatively prohibited from the kind of complexity that I've just shared. I do understand, actually, this is a great segue. Maybe I'll just hop over to my slides quickly because it sort of answers this question, and then I'll pop back out.
As you are doing that, I'm just going to connect to what you presented, because I think even the multisyllabic example that you gave, right, that you, at that point, you wouldn't tell a kid sound by sound, word letter by letter. You would say, look at the chunks. And I know we have talked about morphology, right? Where does morphology come in? So I think just to emphasize, Michelle, understanding the complexity of prompting and the processes, and that you are not done when they can decode. You are just beginning, right?
Oh, that's such an important point, Amelia. I'm so glad you said that. That's another really important point. A lot of researchers have written about the idea that we stop phonics instruction too early. And there's growing research to support the value of morphological awareness development, right? Yes. And what's cool about that research, I think, among other things, is that you see how morphology and attention morphology supports word reading, but it also supports vocabulary development, and it also supports comprehension. And so, you know, you're absolutely right. But I think when legislation is talking about something like, you know, making sure that districts are using a phonics-oriented approach, I don't think that that's meant to prohibit morphological instruction. I think we can consider that part of the broader umbrella of, you know, we need to get kids reading words well.
We only have like 4 minutes, and I do want you to leave us with this big picture, because it's the call to action.
Well, thank you so much, Amelia, for that chance. And it does relate to the question that was asked, which is, I think any of us responding to legislation or any kind of guidance we're getting, we've just got to be careful that we don't overdo or underdo phonics instruction. So, if you're teaching phonics 2 hours a day, that's too much phonics instruction. The research on phonics instruction doesn't test 2 hours a day of phonics instruction. So that's going way beyond the bounds of the current research that we have. Also, don't underdo phonics instruction. I'm in classrooms sometimes where phonics is relegated to a mini lesson. There shouldn't be anything mini about teaching phonics to children in the early grades of schooling. I mean, you do need to really spend that time. So don't overdo or underdo phonics instruction. And then the last thing I want to say, which hopefully is evident just from that conversation with about the prompting, but so important that we don't miss key elements of phonics instruction. Phonics instruction won't work if we're not also developing print awareness. If we're not also developing phonological awareness, probably everyone knows that, but just worth saying again, that our phonics instruction needs to include some explicit instruction in specific applicable generalizations, meaning we might teach that OI usually represents the oi sound, but we're not going to say when two vowels go walking, the first one does the talking, which is actually true less than half the time. So specific generalizations. The kids need that time to actively construct and deconstruct words. If your phonics instruction block consists of the teacher doing all the talking, that's a problem. If your phonics instruction block does not include kids writing and building words, that's a problem. If your phonics instruction block has a lot of chanting, that's probably a problem. So we want kids really actively constructing and engaging. We want to be responsive to the learner, right? You all know some kids find phonics is so easy, and for other kids, this is a challenge, and we need to be responsive to their needs. And then this is another piece I see missing in a lot of places. I'll tell you what, all the phonics instruction in the world, if kids never get a chance to apply it in actual reading and writing, is not going to work.
Not going to work.
And also not going to work to have kids reading and writing all the time without any instruction. So it's that instruction application pairing that is so, so important.
We always say coaching plus practice equals growth. So
very nice. Very nice.
I before you go, I do want to know right now with everything going on, what are you most excited about and what are you most concerned about?
Oh, good questions. I think I'm most excited about the fact that I do think that there's an uptick in it. I'm going to relegate my answer to literacy, that there does seem to be an uptick in interest in what research finds in the area of literacy instruction. And of course, as a researcher, I'm very appreciative of that. I really like to see more people interested in what research has to say. What I'm most worried about is the flip side of that, which is I'm hearing so many people talking about research or talking about the science of reading who've never cracked open a scientific journal in their lives. And I think don't know in some cases what they're talking about. So, research can be our friend, but we have to really engage with it. We've got to actually know, what the studies actually have found and haven't found and haven't yet investigated. So, it's kind of both. I'm both excited about the interest in research and a little bit nervous about the potential, misunderstandings and misapplications that may come along with that, Amelia. So.
If I may, there are two articles that I really think can be helpful when it comes to that. The article by Tim Shanahan on what constitutes the science of reading, where he clearly separates science of reading, the basic science, from science of reading instruction, the applied, and where are we on different things and not to conflate them. The other article by Mark Seidenberg is Lost in Translation. I think those two articles both, I think by ILA, a wonderful edition that they did on the science of reading, so important. I'm so thankful that we have this space where we can talk, where you can explain what we do know, what we don't know. I really appreciate you. I hope that you come back. I would have you like once a month for us to continue this conversation that I think would just do a lot of good for the kids that we serve and for the teachers that we need to empower. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And what I have to say to all the teachers out there is, I mean, really amazing.
job.
Our teachers in this country are just heroic. So
All right.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. What a great session. I hope we all moved from confusion to clarity in helping children become skilled readers. For a quick recap, when it comes to teaching sight words, we learned that memorizing high-frequency words holistically is not the answer. The most powerful mechanism for eventually accessing words by sight happens when graphemes are connected to phonemes. This bonds spellings to individual words, to their pronunciations, along with their meanings in memory. When it comes to prompting young readers, Nell distinguished among the questions young readers are likely to face regularly and the core processes that are involved in these questions. Now, how are you going to use this knowledge to inform instructional practices? What changes will you make? How are you going to know that the changes are an improvement? What are you going to adopt, adapt, abandon? Let us know how you are doing. Make your learning visible and use the hashtag ArcLearns so we can keep up with you. Thank you again. And don't forget, teach like democracy depends on it, because it does.